we're going to have a break after the next talk, but right now we're going to go directly into the next presentation, which is David Foster and Jon Leibowitz will talk about wildlands in the Northeast, visions, progress, and future. I'd like to say a couple of words about each of the speakers, and then I'll ask someone else to come and say a few more words about this. So David Foster, first of all, you can read his bio. He's got a long resume of publications, books, research going back many years. You can read that. I will say I met David in 1982. He has been a mentor and friend to me ever since, sometimes from a distance, sometimes in closer collaboration. We've been collaborating closely recently through Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, and the online quarterly magazine From the Ground Up, which we both helped to edit. The thing that has impressed me about David Foster since I met him is that when I first met him, he was deeply into research, ecological research, and a powerhouse in that. But moved during his career, I watched some from a distance, moved into activism, taking that science, that scientific knowledge, and applying it to conservation, and to actively doing conservation work. And so he brings to the conservation world a deep understanding of ecology, landscape ecology. And it's so important to have that combination. So it's been a real inspiration to me to observe that career path over the years. In my case, I wasn't a very good scientist, so I went straight to doing stuff. I just but to have that deep background, it's been a real inspiration. And David, it's been really a pleasure knowing you all these years, and I appreciate your mentorship and friendship. So David has published a number of books and started the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative in 2005, co-authored Wildlands in New England, actually was the lead author on Wildlands in New England, Past, Present, and Future, which was published a couple of years ago, and we have copies of that over in the dining room available for you. It's a wonderful publication. So their talk will take off on that. Jon Leibowitz has a law degree, but that's okay. He's actually a pretty decent guy. Jon is the president and CEO of Northeast Wilderness Trust, and he's been there since 2017. It's my great pleasure to work with Jon as a member of the board of Northeast Wilderness Trust these days, and their wonderful staff. He's active in many things, has been very involved in Wildlands, Woodlands, Farmlands, and Communities, Rewilding Institute, and the National Land Trust Alliance Leadership Council. But for my, again, a personal reflection, Jon Leibowitz is a collaborator, is an excellent leader. He welcomes all points of view and is gifted at truly collaborating with others to do the important conservation work that Northeast Wilderness Trust is doing to protect wildlands. So I'm going to ask Sarah Adlew of the Old Growth Forest Network to come up and say something else about. Go ahead, Sarah, come on up. Sarah Adlew.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to build on a few more very kind words for Jon. Jon has helped weave together efforts for land trusts to promote wild places in many capacities. And today he first served as executive director and now president and CEO of the Northeast Wilderness Trust. Jon has done things very special in very special ways. He's taken on the difficult work of taking the ideals of forever wild that we all hold and we all hope for and making them real. He has done this in the capacity of leadership, and I'm currently the executive director of the Old Growth Forest Network, and so I know how large of a task this is. He is doing real estate work, fundraising. He's building a staff that carefully listens to the landscape, and it's truly not an easy role to keep all of those plates spinning, and especially spinning when you've stepped away to be at this conference with us. And today we want to honor this really hard work that Jon has done to rewild the Northeast actively and build this promise of forever wild for future generations. And so the reason why I came up to say this is that the Old Growth Forest Network gives out a Forest Advocate Award. And with this award, all of us here search for protected forests and want to see them protected, love lands, and learn the stories of forests. But in our work, we get to see very special people who do the same thing alongside us. And if they could, the trees and all of the forest organisms out there would be thanking these people along with us. And in our culture, there are awards for the best singers, actors, sports stars, Pulitzer Prize winners, but there's no current award for our forest advocates. So the Old Growth Forest Network decided there should be such an award, and we've created the Forest Advocate Award as a small way to honor these special people. So what am I holding here? This is a trophy from the woods. This is a wonderful piece that is spalted white oak and salvaged hickory from, given to us by a storm, I will say. So, Jon, I'd like to present you with our Forest Advocate Award.
This was very unexpected, and thank you so much. It's an honor to serve in the position that I do at Northeast Wilderness Trust. I do what I do because I love wilderness and I love forests. And thank you. Very nice. Appreciate it.
Well, congratulations, Jon. Well deserved. And thank you so much, Sarah and David and Jon. Go ahead and.
Okay, Jon and I would like to follow up on the movie last night and the great introduction this morning by Bob on old growth forests and broaden that to discuss both current and future old growth forests by looking at the wildlands across our region in a variety of perspectives, past, present, and future. So first, to put the region in context. Now, one of the ways we've crafted this conference was to bring in authorities from actually across the country, and we'll hear a number of people from the Pacific Northwest. We'll see your perspectives on the upper Midwest, but today we're focused largely on the Northeast and especially on New England. And it's important as we look at our region to recognize the critical place that it plays in the eastern US and eastern North America, connecting the great forests of the Southeast, from Florida up with the tremendous forest cover in Canada. Keeping these forests intact and keeping them as a functional set of entities is absolutely critical for organisms. It's critical actually for the global climate and environment, and it's certainly critical for society. If we take a look at our region historically, using paleoecological, archaeological, historical, ecological, and increasingly traditional ecological knowledge, we learn an awful lot about it that helps us in our conservation work and our scientific work today. This is just a simple pollen diagram, or the results of a simple pollen and sediment analysis of a series of lakes in Massachusetts, which are emblematic of some of the environmental changes that have occurred in New England, from coring small ponds and hollows in old forests like the one on the right. These curves show actually the effective precipitation. One can think of that as moisture in the landscape or the depth of ponds and lakes. And the remarkable thing that very few people recognize as we talk about the climate getting wetter and wetter in New England is that's actually been the trend for 12,000 years. This is critical when we understand and recognize that forests have changed over time, but they've changed in a way that they've become increasingly mesic. If we then add on to that understanding of the physical environment and look at the cultural and ecological dynamics in our landscape, we recognize that people have been living in this land for 10,000 or more years. And on the left is a relatively crude representation of the distribution and relative abundance of people before European settlement. The population densities and distribution of people varied over time, but all estimates recognize that they reached a peak abundance right before European colonization. At that point in the late woodland period, there was 100,000 or more people in what we call New England today. And if we actually go, and one of the things that we do scientifically is to study this region by coring lakes across the entire region. If we go to the area that was most densely settled, which is the southeastern coast, and in this particular case, in the example on the right, a site on the island of Martha's Vineyard that's actually in the town of what's now called Aquina. It's in the most densely settled part of one of the most densely settled parts of New England. This particular site lies about 1,500 yards from the Wampanoag Cultural Center on Aquina. If we look at this site, and if we just look at a few indicators of the changes in that landscape, at the bottom we see charcoal, which is an indicator of fire occurrence, and above that we see grass and ragweed pollen, which are indicators of the openness or non-wooded or non-forested aspect of the landscape. And what we see for the last 2,000 years is subtle changes, some indication that there's some fire activity, but a real explosion in the indicators for open landscapes and fire beginning with European settlement. And those open land indicators you'll see will parallel the changes that we have in historical data on the actual cover of the vegetation. So all evidence suggests that at the time of European settlement across the New England region, people were living essentially in harmony and equally and fluidly with a natural environment that was functioning in which the forests were largely shaped by natural process, leading to, as Bob has described, a wide range of diversity of old forests that were shaped by many different natural and some subtle to more extreme cultural activities, including wind disturbance much more so than fire. And so this was a dynamic and a changing landscape, but one in which structures that are very uncommon in the landscape today were frequent, both on land and, as we'll hear from many of the talks over this next couple of days, in our waters, shaping them and creating environments and habitats that are relatively uncommon. Well, all of that changed with European settlement and European colonial activities, which led to a massive clearing of the land for agricultural activity and a very intensive modification of the remaining forest cover through forest utilization, wood utilization, leading to these classic curves. At the bottom, we see the overall population expanding from that original 100,000 people or so to our current levels. And we see the landscape being opened up into agricultural land, and then starting in the mid-19th and late 19th century, being abandoned farmland, leading to the natural reclamation of the landscape by forest. And so we're sitting today in a landscape which shows very clearly through history the potential for natural rewilding. And yet the forest cover that exists today is all very much in recovery from that history of use, that history of land clearance, and the ongoing activity. Now, as Bob showed and Monica showed in the movie last night through a number of maps, the transformation of the landscape in the last 200 years is just absolutely remarkable. Gone from largely throughout most of southern and central and even substantial parts of northern New England, cleared agricultural land with scattered, heavily utilized woodlots, to a continuous forest cover, which seems like it's not being modified, but is being modified by the natural process of recovering the ongoing processes of active forest use. The potential in this landscape is absolutely astonishing, and yet we continue to assault it. And in the last slide, we could see for the last 2 to 3 decades, a gradual but unmistakable decline in forest cover in every single New England landscape in every state. And so we see 2 processes shown here on the maps on the left and the right, which are altering our forests in a way that combats all the natural tendency to reclaim the land. On the left is the intensity of harvesting, which is most notable across the state of Maine and in northern New England, but spreads throughout all of the New England region. In the center, we see land clearance, which is ongoing in every state, but most notable in the south and coming in from the eastern shoreboard and then up in the northwestern part of the region. And the consequences is that we have not a uniform distribution of carbon or biomass or tree sizes and extent throughout the landscape, but a very markedly heterogeneous pattern, with actually, most notably, the most carbon-dense forests being in western Massachusetts, north central Massachusetts, and then going up the White and Green Mountains. So our landscape driving through it looks substantially forested and unchanging. We are actually cutting away at that forest cover and modifying it constantly. And it's with those dynamics and that history that we founded wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities. And our vision from the beginning was to halt the relentless destruction of forest and relentless modification of the land, and try to conserve upwards of 60% of, or 80% of the entire landscape in a combination of well-managed forests, well-managed farmlands, and permanently protected wildlands that could operate under natural processes. And then to take the existing 11% or so of the landscape outside wetlands and some waters that contribute the rest, and to make sure that the development that we do is efficient and well conceived and plays off of the natural environment in ways that both nature and people benefit. Now, the most recent study that we've done, which is called the Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, that we'll hear Caitlin Littlefield speak about later in this conference. We estimate that New England could meet the equivalent of our wood needs from our own landscape if we protect and conserve our forests intact, and yet still allow up to 20% or even more of the land to be permanently designated as wildlands to continue to develop naturally. So given that background, what do we actually mean when we talk about wildlands and wilderness and What are its characteristics? What are its benefits? John.
Just get oriented here. Thank you, David. All right, well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and always wonderful to share a stage with you, David. I am gonna start answering these questions by talking about freedom. Freedom is the wellspring of life, and it created the very conditions that gave rise to our civilization and the society that we live in today. And it is the commonality the world over between the world's most biodiverse places. It has the power to recover even the most degraded ecosystems, and its presence, or lack thereof, of freedom defines the outcome of every piece of land across the planet. It is perhaps the single greatest factor that will determine whether a young forest today becomes tomorrow's old-growth forest. And yet, the word freedom isn't often associated with the work that many of us here do, which is land conservation. And so I'm going to dig in a little to that and answer that why. So we're going to first ask, what is wilderness? And perhaps no other word is more misunderstood than that, and I enjoy kind of digging in a little. Wilderness, in its essence, is land that is left to its own will. And the root of the word, which was studied by Professor Jay Vest, who's a member of the Monacan Nation, came to the conclusion that wilderness means will of the land. And so wilderness is self-willed, free land. And likewise, the Wilderness Act of 1964 centered its definition of wilderness on this same concept when its authors intentionally used the word untrammeled, which means unimpeded or free, to define the word. And importantly, in the Wilderness Act, the words pristine or untouched or unpeopled never occurs a single time, because wilderness is about freedom, and it's a place where natural processes are free to direct the ebb and flow of life. And so that's what we're talking about when we say wilderness. Now, another definition from the Wildlands and New England report is that wildlands are tracts of any size and current condition, permanently protected from development, in which management is explicitly intended to allow natural processes to prevail. So again, this concept of free will, that is the commonality, whether you say wilderness, forever wild, ecological reserve, wildland. We're talking about freedom for the land. What happens when land is wild and provided with freedom and free will? So I want to invite you with me a little visual journey to a special place in Maine for a couple minutes. And just off of I-95, a little bit north of Bangor, there is a remnant tract of old-growth forest, which we now have the pleasure and honor of calling Howland Research Forest. And in 2007, this place was at risk of being logged. And with a group of supporters, we stepped in, Northeast Wilderness Trust, and purchased it and protected it as forever wild. For decades, researchers at the University of Maine, the EPA, and NASA have worked at Howland to better understand old forests and carbon storage, and work that continues today. And Howland actually has the second longest running carbon flux data in the nation, behind Harvard Forest's record. And Howland Research Forest was also at one point the most photographed place on Earth from space, which is pretty amazing. So there is nothing ecologically exceptional about Howland, and I say that because it's flat. It has poorly drained acidic soils that lack richness, that otherwise promote rare species or rare natural communities, and thus the trees and plants are all common. This is another scene from it. The exceptional thing about Howland Forest is that it has been provided the freedom to grow old, complex, and beautiful. And so as you walk along the path at Howland, there's a couple trails that go to different research areas. You can feel below your feet an incredibly spongy floor, and the air is dense beneath that thick old canopy, and you start to notice things about the forest. And you notice the tip-ups and the moss-covered floor and the lichen and the fallen trees and the cavities that they create, and there's snags everywhere. And it's a mosaic. It's not only of old trees, even though it's an old-growth forest, but it's a mosaic of old and young trees. And this complexity is not only beautiful, at least to my eyes, it also creates resilience and harbors rich biodiversity. And if given time and freedom to grow old, this is a good example of what a forest in New England wants to be. It wants to be a little messy, and as Henry David Thoreau wrote in 1864 of Maine's North Woods, it wants to be a little mossy and moosey. And I mention Henry David Thoreau because, in fact, many trees still living at Howland today were just approaching their teenage years when he wrote those words. The average age of a tree at Howland Research Forest is 125 years old, and that is because the forest has been free to grow. Now, this is a photo of the Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve just north of where I live, just north of Montpelier, and it was protected by Newt a few years ago. Unlike Howland, this is not an old forest, it's not old growth. The Wilderness Trust bought it from a timber company, and it had been actively managed for many decades. Very well managed, I'll add, but it was managed. But now, today, it's been legally protected as forever wild and has thus been offered that freedom to evolve, to grow complex, and heal, which is a process that we often call rewilding. And the natural result of that decision in the ensuing process is to put down the roots of tomorrow's old growth forests. And so while old growth only makes up a tiny fraction of the Northeast, every single place protected today, like Woodbury, helps chart a different path and a more hopeful path for the future. And you'll hear later in the conference from Tom Butler and Shelby Perry and John Davis and others about rewilding. And that is the act of protecting places as wilderness, one way to do it, no matter their current condition. And it is the greatest tool in our toolbox for more old growth to return to the Northeast. And beyond that hopeful vision of knowing that every place protected today as wilderness has that opportunity, I'm going to take a really shallow dive into why else we should protect wilderness. Many of these things will be covered through various panels throughout the conference. So the first is its intrinsic value. Wilderness and the species who call these places home simply have a right to live and to flourish regardless of any benefit that they provide to us. Wilderness has always existed, and we believe it ought to continue existing. We also know that the species of the Northeast evolved with old forests, as David was talking about, and they thrive within them. There are a suite of wild critters who are more successful in old and wild forests versus young and managed forests, and species richness is not always but often higher in older forests. We also know that old and wild forests become older and wilder, and thus they store and sequester immense amount of carbon as they age and grow older. We also know that wilderness acts as a crucial baseline to the surrounding landscape. Whether a place is being managed for old growth characteristics or it's being managed for timber products, we can look towards wilderness areas to understand the baseline for what a forest might be in any particular location. And importantly, whether for cultural religious or other reasons, wilderness offers spiritual and physical renewal and human well-being for those of us who seek them out. And a couple more is recreation. Recreational pursuit has long been an essential element of wilderness designations, particularly because wilderness has long been viewed as a place to reconnect with the natural world. And finally, as forests grow old, they increase in complexity, and when it's wilderness, they do that naturally, and that results in more complex structure and function, which increases resiliency to stressors, such as climate change and pests. And this benefits the entire landscape far beyond the boundaries of any particular wild place. And so all of those values naturally result in when you protect places as forever wild or as wilderness. And all of that happens naturally by providing freedom. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to David, and then we're going to do a little swap again.
So at the opening this morning, I said that every talk that we have should end up with a discussion of action and what we all can do. But in order to do that, you need to have information. And we recognized in 2005, when we put together the Wildlands and Woodlands first report, that we actually had not only a very poor estimate of old growth areas in the state of Massachusetts and across New England, we had absolutely no understanding of the distribution of these kinds of wildlands, these wilderness areas, these areas that are permanently protected with a dedicated intent to be allowed to develop naturally. And so in 2023, we pulled together a group of people to develop a research program to do that comprehensively. And this is actually the first time anywhere in the United States that all of the public and private areas that are operating in the way John just described have been categorized, mapped, and characterized. It took a big effort. It took a lot of individuals, many more than show up here on the right as authors, and many more agencies and organizations and individual efforts to compile all that information. And the message that comes out from that is quite mixed. There is this remarkable quality of the New England landscape that's shown on the left, in which more than 80% of the land is still in forest cover. And so one has this perception of an intact landscape, which we all know is faulty at this kind of, a faulty impression from this kind of scale. But nonetheless, it's a staggering amount of forest and a great potential. If we then look at the central map here, we can see that over more than 100 years of effort and increasing dedication by local, statewide, and regional, and national and international entities, that a remarkable amount of land has actually been permanently conserved from development. 25% or a little bit more across the entire region. And that's a tremendous accomplishment. It doesn't, of course, ensure that the 80% is going to persist from deforestation. And so there's much more work to be done there. But then if we actually apply the definitions that John provided us, we see that less than 4% of the entire region is permanently protected in wildlands. From this information, we can make plans for the future and we can take action. First, we ask, well, where are these wildlands and what do we do to change that pattern? The distribution is highly heterogeneous. We see that actually there are big parts of the map where there are few wildlands, even in heavily forested areas. We also see, and if we look closely in conjunction with other maps, topographic maps, for example, we see that the preponderance of these areas are in the north, and they're at higher elevation, which makes a lot of sense. We see that there are relatively few, especially in comparison to adjoining states like New York and its Adirondack Park, which is more than 3 million acres of wildlands. We can see that there are few large tracts of wildlands. We can see that small ones are scattered across much of the region. And then we can see this very interesting and peculiar, very narrow band of wildlands that stretches along the Appalachian Trail, and that's the result of the kind of wisdom, foresight, and energy of Benton MacKaye, who viewed the potential for a wild way that would stretch the entire length of what he was also conceiving of, which was a trail called the Appalachian Trail from Maine to Georgia. If we start breaking things down state by state, we see other patterns. First, starting at the upper left, at the regional scale, we can see that actually the wildlands that do exist have come through a combination of effort by private entities, private organizations, and agencies working at a state and federal level. And in fact, at a regional scale, they're pretty comparable. But if we then look in at the individual states, we see that the pattern is even more heterogeneous. The state of Massachusetts, for example, in the top right, is almost predominantly represented by wildlands that occur on state agency lands, the kinds of lands that Bob studies for old-growth forests. And I need to note that in this report, we also characterize the strength of wildland protection. And state agency protection across most of the New England states is among the weakest levels of protection. And that's certainly true in Massachusetts, where there is no legislative mandate for protection of old-growth forests or of these wildlands, and there's no other legal protection for the majority of them. So it's an administratively or management plan characteristic and security that guarantees these as wildlands. And then if we look at New Hampshire and a little bit less at Vermont, we can see this huge reliance on federal activity, which of course is predominantly wilderness areas in the White Mountains and Green Mountains that contribute most of the protected wildlands in those states. So it's a very heterogeneous pattern. If we then look at the timeline of wildland protection, we can see that it's been going on through wilderness designation and other actions like the actions of Battelle here in our backyard, or the actions of Baxter up in Maine. Wildland protection has been an idea that took root early and has been continuous. And we see two trends that are really very positive and give us optimism. The first trend is the overall increase, especially in the last couple of decades, in wildland protection, wildland preservation. So big jumps in the graph to the right. And we can see that much of that is due to ongoing and increased activity at a state level, the blue part of the bars, and the new involvement at a major level of organizations like NUD, organizations that are private, nonprofit organizations that are conserving these lands. So out of this report come a series of recommendations that I'd like to elaborate in a little bit more detail. The first is kind of putting the wildlands, woodlands, farmlands, and communities hat on. The recognition that we can't just single-mindedly protect wildlands or wilderness areas. We need to do that with a comprehensive approach that looks at the entire region, that marries together land planning and regulation with active permanent land protection. So conservation and planning, development and land protection working in harvest. Secondly, overall, with less than 4%, clearly we need to greatly increase the extent, the pace, the size of wildlands. And I would advocate, and I know I don't need to look to Jon to know that he would strongly advocate, for at least 20% of the region being our goal. And I know there are people in the audience who are disappointed with that number. So to produce this map, to produce this map and this data and this report, we compiled all this information into the interactive web map that I showed previously, and you'll see further during this conference. That is up and available to be seen with the database behind it available. We are actively maintaining that. WWF&C is doing that through the great work of Brian Hall, former employee of the Harvard Forest, who now continues to work with us and maintain this. And so we actually look to everyone here to continue to not only protect these areas, but to inform us of other potential areas that may already exist that we've overseen. So if you know areas that meet these criteria that Jon has talked about, please let us know. We also recognize that not only do we need to increase land conservation, we need to strengthen the protection of the existing wildlands, and we need to fill those holes across the region that are not represented by wildlands. And so you'll hear at this conference a wildland prioritization talk that is given by a combination of individuals representing Newt, Wildlands and Woodlands, and Vermont Agency for Natural Resources, which are working to do that, to understand which kinds of ecosystems across the region are not yet represented in this type of land protection. We're trying to build then on this state analysis by doing a comprehensive state by state for the 6 New England state analysis of what is the current status of wildland preservation. And so this is actually an invitation to people in this audience. We have a very good understanding of what the status of wildland legislation, wildland policy, wildland funding is for the states of Massachusetts and Vermont. We are trying to build a stronger capacity and understanding of that for the rest of the New England states. So if you're someone who is interested in that or knows a lot about that and would like to dig in more into that and contribute to this effort, we would love to partner with you. If you don't do it, we will figure out a way to do it, but we would love partners to step forward. And then finally, we are going to do everything we can to support a wide range of ongoing efforts to advance wildland preservation. And I'd like to go into a few of those to begin with. First, and we'll hear some talks by people we've already heard from Steve this morning. We'll hear talks by Chris Kleiza, we'll hear talks by John Davis, we'll hear talks by other people, Tom Butler and others. There is a very long history of wildland thinking and advocacy in this region that we need to draw on. And one thing we need to remember is that there have been outstanding big visions for what could happen to wildlands in the New England region. And while we work to protect every area that we can and make sure that all ecosystems are represented, I think we don't want to step away from those big visions of large areas where natural processes can operate at a landscape scale. So I show here 3 maps. The one is one that came out of the early work by Jamie Sion, looking at the headwaters region that encompassed northern New England. The second, of course, is the long-standing and continuing advocacy of restore for establishing a large national park, a large wilderness region across the region. And then the third, shown by the Eastern Wildway, is just the vision for connecting New England with the rest of the East. We can then focus in and identify organizations and efforts that are doing good work that we want to support more, or that where good efforts can be improved through additional work. So I mentioned Benton MacKay and the Appalachian Trail. Well, there's a Northern Appalachian Trail Landscape Partnership, which consists of the regional conservation partnerships that fall within the Appalachian Trail region, and all the individual land trusts and state and federal entities and local entities that are contributing to those efforts. And as that work proceeds, and their interest is to build on the existing kind of corridor of protected land of all types that goes down the Appalachian Trail, we need to help them to work to keep Mackay's vision alive, which is to not just conserve the land intact, but to conserve it as a wild way. And most people are not familiar with the fact that Benton MacKay on a number of occasions said, it's much more important to conserve the wilderness than it is to complete the trail. We need to build on great efforts like the one in Vermont, with recent legislation that have really brought the planning effort, the statewide Act 250 work, up to a way that it can be complementary with conservation design, the focus on land protection that is driven by a great knowledge of the understanding of biodiversity and the intact nature of the landscape. We need to build on that and make sure that there is equivalent legislation that supports permanent land protection and permanent preservation of wild areas. And the one note that I would draw there is that there's a goal for conserving 10% of the landscape in old forests. But old forests are not necessarily wildlands, because as we all know, you can manage for some old forest characteristics, but you can't actively manage for wilderness and for wildlands. That's accomplished through passive management. And then there's some tremendous efforts by the Appalachian Mountain Club, the Nature Conservancy, the National Park Service, federal agencies, and of course Baxter, to create this growing wilderness wildland area in northern Maine, which could lead to something even greater and bigger. And then I come back to my state of Massachusetts and recognize again the weak nature of wildland security and protection there. So much work to be done, but much to laud, because there is a recent declaration that those areas will be legislatively conserved. That's not yet happened, but there is at least the commitment to that. There also is the commitment to change the shape of that pie graph and to add a big segment of private land conservation. And the state has had an initial effort to add $5 million of funding to advance ecological reserves on private lands. Now, unfortunately, the definition of those reserves is not firmly established, and so we would work with them to try to encourage a wildland definition so those reserves are true reserves. And then finally, there's some growing work, and I'd call out the Kestrel Land Trust, I'd call out the Trustees of Reservations in Massachusetts, a number of other small land trusts, and some statewide land trusts like the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, which have done a tremendous job in starting to conserve wildlands, as broadening their portfolio from just conserving land and actively managed land to include those that are forever wild. So Newt does not act alone. It's got partners, and as we'll hear, it is working with partners. And so I'm going to switch over for the last time to invite Jon to come up and talk more about the specific work of wildland preservation and to conclude this overall presentation. Thanks.
Okay, hello again. So we're going to quickly answer where and how are wildlands being protected. So to first answer how, we're going to go back to the Wildlands in New England report, which answers the question, what makes a wildland? Beyond that specific definition, how is it determined if a place is to be considered as such? If you're running a land trust and you want to protect a wildland, these are the three things that you ought to ask. And importantly, this is not black and white. It's a gradient like everything, but you want to focus on the intent. Is there a clear intent for a piece of land to be wild? Wilderness, wildland, forever wild. The management scheme. Is it actively being managed in an untrammeled state? And finally, as David talked about, permanent protection. In other words, is there something that makes sure that this place will be wild in the future? And so those are the three prongs that one ought to ask, thinking about how to create a wildland. And so let's put this into context. This is a similar map that David showed. It includes New York because Northeast Wilderness Trust works in the Adirondack region. But this map shows all the conserved land in the Northeast, both public and private. And as David pointed out, it's really impressive. About a quarter of New England has been conserved, and more when you include New York. However, it is again worth noting that a vast majority of the conserved land that you see on this map is actively managed, whether it be for agriculture or forestry, both very important, but that means they won't actively, naturally progress to the ecological conditions that are characteristic of an old-growth forest. Some of it, of course, could, but it's not designed as such, and so it's lacking that intent that we're talking about. I always find it important when comparing wildlands and woodlands, which is somewhat of a false comparison, to repeat that all land conservation is vitally important, and we need both wildlands and woodlands and farmlands. And while it's all important, I also like to point out that at the same time, when it comes to biodiversity protection and carbon storage, they are not the same thing, and that's okay. We can hold both of those things at the same time, and that's the importance of wildlands. So I want you to really sear that greenness into your mind's eye, and then look at this map, which is the exact same data that David showed, and you can really see the difference between all conserved land and wildlands. And again, to go back and forth, not very much. So as David said, only about 3.5% of New England has been conserved as wild, and of course, more when you include the incredible Adirondacks and Catskills in New York. And looking at this map, the public lands are quite obvious. You've got Baxter in Maine, right in the center of the state. You've got the White Mountains and the Green Mountains and the Adirondacks. But what I want to point out, because I work in the world of private conservation, is that there's also these large privately protected wildlands. So that circle is the 40,000 acre Debskeneg Ecological Reserve, which is owned by the Nature Conservancy, and then a forever wild easement is held by Forest Society of Maine. And then in northern New Hampshire is the 10,000 acre Vicky Bunnell Preserve, which is also owned by the Nature Conservancy, and Northeast Wilderness Trust holds a forever wild easement on it. And then moving into where we are, my home state here, is the 6,000 acre Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve, which Northeast Wilderness Trust owns in fee, and we've donated a forever wild easement to a great local organization called the Vermont River Conservancy. And so what you might notice is a commonality between all three of these examples. is that it's owned by a nonprofit or a land trust, and there's a second layer of permanent conservation on it in the form of a conservation easement held by another entity. And so that gets to the crucial fact of these three criteria: intent, management, and permanence. And so when the data was being compiled for the Wildlands and New England report, as David mentioned, of that tiny 3.5%, 3.3% of New England that's been conserved as wild, a full 1/3 of those lands lack durable, permanent protection. And in other words, they're protected largely through management plans or impermanence. And so, again, when it comes to wild land protection, whether it's private or public land, serving as the stage for rewilding and the return of old growth conditions, I would argue that durability is absolutely paramount, and that's the permanent prong of the Wildlands in New England report. It takes decades or centuries for old growth conditions to return to a forest, and mere days or weeks for the clock to be reset through resource extraction. And so in the case of this photo, this is the Alder Stream Wilderness Preserve, which is in the vicinity of Baxter in central Maine. And here again, it's the 7,000 acre preserve that Northeast Wilderness Trust owns. So we have it in fee. Its intent is to be wild. Its management is wild. And we've donated a Forever Wild easement to the Forest Society of Maine, and that's where the permanence comes in. So this is the how between or behind those three prongs. And I want to give just a few examples. And the first is an initiative that was highlighted in Wildlands in New England, and that's the Wildlands Partnership, which is us working, Northeast Wilderness Trust working with other organizations to place Forever Wild conservation easements on their property. And we launched this in a lot of great conversation with David and Wildlands and Woodlands a few years ago, and we've protected almost, by the end of the year, 19,000 acres of wilderness in partnership with other land trusts who may or may not have otherwise been doing Forever Wild conservation. And one great example, sorry, I'm speeding through this, I've been given the 1-minute warning. One great example is Northwest Connecticut, which the Appalachian Trail comes through. We've worked with a number of incredible organizations down there, the Norfolk Land Trust, Cornwall Conservation Trust, Salisbury Association, and we have protected now hundreds of acres in an area that previously did not have a lot of designated wildlands. One more example, and then I'm going to get to my conclusion here, is an active project that has consumed much of my life for the last 2 years in Maine, and it's called the McGalloway Collaborative. More than just wildland conservation, this is an incredible project that speaks to the value of partnership and speaks to the core vision of wildlands and woodlands. So in close partnership with the Forest Society of Maine, with the Nature Conservancy, and Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust, we are together protecting 78,000 acres in western Maine. And of those 78,000 acres, that's an outline of the property, Northeast Wilderness Trust will be acquiring and permanently conserving 11,000 acres as wilderness. This will be New England's newest wilderness area. It is cool, thank you. The project fills a donut hole of 500,000 acres of protected land. All of that in green is protected. And in addition to the wildland side, a chunk of the land will remain privately owned and managed for timber, and that also will have a permanent conservation easement on it. And what I find to be really exciting about this property is that, so the red part on the top is what Northeast Wilderness Trust is buying, 11,200 acres. It's adjacent, that's the New Hampshire-Maine line. It's adjacent to a 12,000 or so acre wildland that was protected by TNC a couple decades ago. And when combined, we are achieving 25,000 acres of privately protected wilderness all within a matrix forest block, which is one of the highest priorities for conservation. And so this is another great example, like the Woodbury Mountain Preserve. These 11,000 acres that we're buying are not old growth, they're very far from it, but through those three prongs of intent and permanence and management, it will be and has the chance to become an old growth forest of the future. So to close, you've heard a history of the wildlands, its definition and progress, and some current examples. And I want to conclude by painting a picture for everyone as you walk into this incredible gathering that we're here to imagine a future with me. And so I invite you to think about what that future might look like a century from now, that we have the opportunity at this very moment to create and to leave to future generations, like my adorable son right there, and possibly future grandchildren if I'm so lucky. And so I want you to first, in this imagined future, think about the fact that WWF&C's bold vision has become a reality, and an overwhelming majority of the forests and farms of New England have been permanently conserved, 80% of the region. And of that amount, 20% has been protected as wilderness, at least 20%. We'll go with that. And across those conserved forests, towering pines that stretch over 100 feet into the sky, and century-old maples and oaks and hemlocks and beech are common sight, not the exceptions to the norm. And each spring in the canopy of this older forest, it's graced by the melodies of countless warblers, all who have found their niche in the complexity of a rewilded landscape. And like the warblers, marten and fisher and other mammals find ample habitat in the resurgence of those complex forests that are full of snags and tip-ups and all the characteristics of an old forest. And dams have come down, perhaps, and schools of salmon and shad once again fill free-flowing rivers, feeding wildlife and people and the forests themselves. Cougars, mountain lions, catamounts, whatever you like to call them, and wolves, our region's missing carnivores, have been welcomed home. They keep prey in check and they help us learn the important lessons of coexistence. And across the landscape, farmlands, timberlands, and expansive wilderness areas are all knitted together, offering freedom and space for non-humans and humans alike to thrive amidst all of this natural abundance. And those wilderness areas that have been protected, they're all getting older. And many are starting to resemble the remnant pockets of old-growth forests that sparked a movement to do more and chart a new course a century ago. This is a future that I believe in and the Northeast Wilderness Trust believes in, and I believe many of you do as well, that it's worth working towards. It is a hopeful future of more biodiversity, more abundance, more natural beauty, and more old forests. And the future, very importantly, is more than possible. It is completely achievable. We know how to do it, and that's by protecting more wilderness right now and rewilding the Northeast and providing freedom for our wild neighbors in the entire community of life. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David and John, for providing us with the vision, with the foundation for the remainder of this conference, and for hope for the future. Our next speaker has graciously offered to cede a couple of minutes of her time so that we can maybe take one or two questions for David and or John. And if you could get the next, if somebody could get the next slide. So who's got a question? Yes, right there. David and John, come on up. Can you kind of come up?
Thank you very much. I wondered, as you were speaking towards the 20% march, as you begin to encroach upon the humans, what the tax consequences are for the property that's being wildly conserved, and as you get closer to municipalities and perhaps, closer to the coastline, what kind of obstacles are there, and do you have a plan on how to address that? I guess my first question is, do those properties come off the tax rolls?
Sure. So the question is, as we're approaching 20% with that goal, which is millions of acres, what happens to the tax base? Because so much of our local school and property taxes are coming from private land. So I'll speak only from Northeast Wilderness Trust's perspective. Every land trust handles this differently. Northeast Wilderness Trust pays property taxes, and we do that specifically in Vermont and New Hampshire using its current use programs, or use value appraisal here in Vermont that it's called. In Maine and New York, we file for exemption, but we are in the process of launching a pilot program, which means a payment in lieu of taxes. So we do qualify for exemption, but we are choosing to pay taxes, perhaps for the very reasons that you're getting at, that there's very real implications for removing so much private land from the tax base. I also just note that it's somewhat of a cultural and regional question. In southern New England, there is really no expectation for nonprofits and land trusts to pay property taxes, and that's just how it's been for a long time. And so we own a couple pieces of land in Massachusetts, and we do file for exemption there. David would know more about this and have a better opinion perhaps, but I think the heart of your question is that if we do want to, or a way of answering to get to the heart of the question is, if we do want to realize that much more wildland, whether it's on public land or whether it's private land, we probably need to rethink how we generate taxes for communities, because we wouldn't want to do this kind of work at the expense of local schools and local communities. So it's a really important thing for us to think through as this evolves.
Yeah, let me just add, it's a great question, because it's one that comes up from many audiences. A lot of the land protection that would lead to wildland protection would be actually the redesignation of existing public lands, and those lands, the kind of tax setting for those lands would not change. And that actually might save money, because a lot of the active management on public and even some private lands is not actually producing income over the expenses of doing that. The other way that, interestingly, a number of organizations are operating is to take their existing land, this would be land trusts, and look at it and say, well, half of our land has never been actively managed. Maybe we should redesignate that and apply the intent, management, and permanent protection of that land that we already own. So there could be an awful lot of wildland protection without any new acquisition of land.
Well, we're out of time. I'm afraid we're out of time for questions. Again, we have people who are going to be here, and you can catch them and ask them questions, but we'll need to move on now. I want to again thank David Foster and Jon Leibowitz very much for